Welcome back. In recent months, violence on public transit has become a major concern for many New Yorkers. Joining me to discuss the rise of subway violence in New York City is Policy and Communications Director for Riders Alliance, Danny Pearlstein. Danny, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
So, can you tell me about your organization, Riders Alliance?
Sure. We are a grassroots organization of subway and bus riders, and we are fighting for better public transit service on our subways and buses. Accessible, affordable, reliable, frequent, world-class public transit for the millions of New Yorkers who depend on it and for the city that thrives on it.
Now, subway violence has always been an issue for our city. And I'm thinking even way back, probably before I was born, I heard it was even worse. What are some of the most common displays of violence that the MTA currently has issues with?
Sure. So millions of people ride the subway every day, and it's overwhelmingly without incident. 3.5 million people rode the subway, on an average day just last week and probably today as well. And the subway is overwhelmingly safe most of the time. But that said, not everyone feels safe, welcome, and included on the subway. And, tragically, the subway, because it's a public square, is subject to the same pressures as other public spaces. And so, as the papers have reported, there have been assaults underground, there have been robberies underground. New Yorkers, it's something we all have to look out for, and it's something that the city is actively trying to deal with. And you saw the police in that picture. 10% of the NYPD force is actually underground patrolling the subways, even though it's really roughly about 2% of a reported crime, less than 2%, that happens underground.
Now, why do you think these acts of violence remain an issue for the MTA and for New Yorkers?
Well, any act of violence is too many, right? Is one too many. I mean, nobody should be victimized in public transit. It's a public space. We should all feel safe and welcome there. But, unfortunately, during the pandemic, subway ridership plummeted very dramatically. And, by the same token, violent incidents and crimes decreased in parks, where there were more people than ever before when people were outside and had no place else to go really through much of 2020. So a lot of that has to do with where people are. The big success story of the subway over the generation, like you were saying, since before we were born, is the subway got much, much safer as ridership grew, even as the number of police officers declined. It's really about safety in numbers.
Now, I'm really happy that you mentioned that because according to the New York Post, Mayor Adams says New Yorkers are safe on the subway system. What we must do is remove the perception of fear. What are your thoughts on this statement, and do you agree or disagree?
There's a lot to what the mayor said. What we have seen is that the subway is the focus of a national conversation about crime, and that crime in the subway tends to be sensationalized. There was a subway shooting last month that was by far the worst shooting in the subway in 40 years, and it made the biggest news about the subway practically in 40 years. Everyone is tuned to the idea that the subway is very dangerous, even though millions of people use it every day without incident. So crime on the subway is magnified, and an injury to one on the subway is really an injury to every rider. We all take the subway. We don't know exactly where it occurred, but we feel it acutely because we know what it's like to be in the subway. We know how it feels. We know how vulnerable we feel, I think, at times. But it's important to keep the stats in perspective, and I think that's what the mayor was getting at there.
And I can definitely agree to some of what you said because I think I've been taking the subway since I was a teenager, going to high school. And in recent months, I've never felt more afraid to be on the subway because of what I was hearing. So I'm kind of glad that you brought that up. Following the shooting on the Brooklyn train station that harmed about 23 people, New Yorkers found that the cameras used for added protection did not work. How should those in public transportation be held accountable for that?
Well, I think not only the cameras didn't work, the police radios didn't work, right? And we've been hearing about police radios since 9/11, right? Over 20 years where the police radios haven't effectively communicated. We can't rely on technology in these cases. I think there's some notion that we could just have metal detectors and there wouldn't be any guns in the subway. But the fact is that wouldn't work either. The people who came through during the attack last month were transit workers and riders helping one another. I think that's really shows New York at its best, even as we're also seen as our most vulnerable. So I think that, of course, it's important to get the cameras working. Of course, it's important to get the radios working. But we can't count on technology to keep us safe underground or in any other parts of public space.
So since you bring up technology, I really want to know your thoughts on the addition of metal detectors on the subway system. Do you think that will be helpful?
It's not going to work. And And I think it's a distraction from things that are important and that will work. For example, right now, it's more dangerous to walk to the train than to ride it, right? Reckless driving is skyrocketing in the city. Collision deaths on our street tragically are mounting by the day. Last week was an incredibly deadly week, as we all saw. So we need, ironically, there is one place technology really would help us, right? We need our speed cameras and our red light cameras on 24/7, helping drivers slow down and drive more safely. Because it's outrageous that hundreds of people are killed on our streets every year from bad driving. So that's one thing we can tackle, but we shouldn't distract, right? It's very important that our leaders should not distract with shiny objects like metal detectors when there are things we can do concretely to make us a lot safer.
Now, a lot of the attackers have been linked to homelessness or people dealing with mental health issues. Is this problematic or is it an unfortunate reality?
Unfortunately, because of decades of disinvestment, we have a series of crises playing out in our public space, and that's nowhere more visible than on the subway. Now, we know statistically, homeless people with mental illness are the most vulnerable to being attacked or hurt or tragically even murdered on the subway. And we've seen that last year and this year. So it's really important not to scapegoat and not to blame people who we're angry at for the problems of the system, for the problems of society. That said, it's not acceptable that the subway is a place to live of last resort, right? Government needs to provide better options. In this case, safe, private places to live so that people don't resort to living in the subway. Because police can't solve that problem. Police can't just move people along or send people to Rikers Island where something horrible could happen to them that's effectively just a revolving door back to the subway. That's no solution at all. It's very expensive. We've tried it many times. It's no solution at all. We need safe, private places for people to be. That's the way to move people permanently off the subway. And we need mental health care, right? We absolutely need more investments in mental health care for people suffering serious illness.
I'm really glad that you pointed that out. Is there a way for New Yorkers to prioritize safety without stigmatizing people from those vulnerable communities?
It's appropriate. Sorry, it's essential that we look at root causes, right? I mean, so from our part, we want to see more train service and more bus service so that trips are faster, so that more people want to ride, so that people spend less time waiting uncomfortably on platforms or at bus stops, and that we get more safety in numbers. We also want to see investments in an end to homelessness and actual treatment for the seriously mentally ill, because all of those things will help make the subway safe and welcoming and inclusive for all New Yorkers and everyone who visits the city. They'll help make the subway what it really ought to be, right? Which is a public space where we can all come together successfully and without violence.
So you kind of briefly mentioned a few upgrades like being faster and more efficient, but I noticed that when it comes to upgrades for the MTA, stations in low-income areas usually see them last. Would the city benefit from implementing these changes in low-income or high-risk neighborhoods?
Well, one of the things we've seen throughout the pandemic is that round the clock is the new rush hour. And the previous rush hour, the pre-COVID era, the subway service plan was really designed around white-collar office commuters, in many cases, white office commuters. And what we've seen throughout the pandemic is what was a minority ridership is now overwhelmingly people of color and also overwhelmingly people commuting outside the traditional rush hours. So we need to re-envision the whole system, not just the stations, but the whole service around the people who use the subway most, who are the people we're all relying on to go to work, right? Some of us can work in our closets, but for people who need to work on the front lines of the pandemic or doing the important services we need every day around the city, they shouldn't have to wait so long for a train. They should have a quick train every 6 minutes, early in the morning, late at night, on the weekend, to restore time in their lives and to demonstrate the gratitude we all have toward the people who keep the city moving.
So that was a really interesting thing that you pointed out, and I kind of want to touch on it a little bit more. Can you just explain? I didn't know that just they plan these times around certain workers. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. So if you think of the traditional 9 to 5 rush hour, between 6, 7:38 in the morning and 4, 5, 6 o'clock at night, those are the peak times for service when trains are coming most frequently. But nowadays, we know that essential workers overwhelmingly commute at least one part of their commute is outside that period of time. And lots of people are commuting on Saturdays and Sundays when not only are the trains a lot less frequent, but there's lots of work going on in the subway system to maintain it. And that means that service is even less, reliable. And so we need to look at all of that because all that needs to change, right? We need not just the built infrastructure, but the service that runs on it designed around the people who need it most. And that is service workers. That's not office workers at this point. So we need to see that shift. It hasn't happened yet, but it's incredibly important to the future of the city, the transit system, and the families whose workers are, keeping the city moving.
So we have just a little under 2 minutes left. I want to talk about just the control the MTA has over public transportation in New York City. How can New Yorkers just make their voices heard when it comes to what they want out of our transit system?
The most important thing to know is that the MTA is controlled by the governor. The governor hires the top managers and she appoints the entire board, even the folks recommended by the mayor. Right? They all come through the governor's office. The last governor held up a lot of the appointees of the last mayor. They never even got a vote in the Senate. So the governor controls the MTA. That's incredibly important. The other piece of it is the mayor controls the streets. The city owns the streets. The mayor's in charge of city government. The ability to buses to move on our streets, to be prioritized ahead of other traffic on our streets, that's a decision for the mayor. This mayor has made a commitment of 150 miles of new bus lanes in the next 4 years. We intend to hold him to it. But we also intend to build riders' power and to win, working with this governor, to win 6-minute service, to acknowledge that round the clock is the new rush hour, and we have a debt of gratitude that we haven't yet paid to the essential workers who keep our city running.
All right, well, Danny, it was a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me. Can you quickly just let people know how they can stay up to date with you?
Sure. Check us out on Twitter at Riders Alliance, Facebook Riders Alliance, ridersalliance.org. Join us. Build our power together. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, thank you for joining us. We'll be
Have a nice
right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.